Hi guys, it's Tolu from Kugali, and today I'm interviewing my best friend, one of my best friends, Ziki Nelson. Pen name, by the way. Hey man, introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Ziki, co-founder of Kugali and also the one of the contributors to the anthology with my debut graphic novel Iku.
Right. So I've read issue one of Iku, and while you were writing it, you were sending me scripts to proofread and asking for my opinion. I gave some input, but then when I read issue two, I didn't have that same experience with issue two because you didn't send me stuff to proofread. So issue two was completely new for me, and after issue two, I know about as much as all our other readers. I don't know more about the story than anyone outside Kugali. So just want to start with, what is the story about? Tell us about Iku.
Iku is a dark fantasy that follows the plight of a cursed warrior. He's plagued by the spirits of the dead that demand that he carry out vengeance on their behalf. So think of, say, Ghost Whisperer meets the Punisher. It's something along those lines. And this curse is driving him to the brink of madness. So it's how he deals with living in constant torment.
Since we were kids, you've always wanted to write stuff. You've written so many different characters and stories. Why did you choose this one to put in the anthology?
Um, well, these things kind of tend to you kind of tend to so with Kugali we kind of stumbled into Kugali rather than it being some sort of master plan on our part, and this story is very similar in the sense that I started writing. So I studied screenwriting in university, and I wrote a script for my final year project. In fact, I wrote many scripts, and it just felt like a bit of a waste having these scripts sort of collect digital dust. So I looked at the ones I got the highest marks for, and I thought, okay, well, how could I adapt this to a comic book setting? And when you sort of transition from film to comic books, there are just certain things you have to change because they're two completely different mediums, and so a new story sort of evolved out of that, and that story was Iku. So it felt like the natural story that I would contribute towards the anthology.
All right, cool. So where is the story set?
So it's set in a fictional kingdom that's supposed to be in what most of us will call West Africa. So the kingdom draws inspiration from a number of ancient West African kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Oyo, which is part of modern day Nigeria, the Dahomey Kingdom, which is part of modern day Benin, even the Mali Empire, which is, I mean, obviously Mali, and a bunch of other kingdoms as well.
Well, from everything you said, it's obviously inspired by West Africa, but it's not set in a fictional West Africa. It's set in a fictional nation designed after West Africa. That is the kingdom of Awu, right?
Ewu, yes.
Awu. How did you get that name? Because I'm looking at it on the magazine right now, and like it's not a Yoruba word I recognize.
Okay, so the name of Ewu is just me sort of mashing up words. So I wanted to take the word a word that means earth, because it's essentially the kingdom of Earth. That's what it's supposed to mean.
All right.
And then I just took the word for Earth in a bunch of various West African languages, and then I just jumbled them up together, more or less.
Good job. Okay, so this art style, it's kind of, to me, like when I read the comic, I always get this Samurai Jack kind of feel. Not that it has the same art style with Samurai Jack, but you get the feeling that it's dark and gory and serious. Yet the art looks something. The art looks kind of childish, so kind of
Mm.
cartoony, but then the content is not. So, like, how did you, was this decision made by you or your artist, or like, how did this come about?
Well, I suppose it's just working towards the natural strengths of my artist, Christina, because she has a very naturally childish. I mean, she's very, very well suited for children's books and children's illustrations. But obviously, this story isn't suited for such. So it's sort of an amalgamation between my my dark and twisted mind and her sort of childlike art style. But one thing I'd like to also point out as well is that reading a lot of comics, I noticed that comics that tend to have a more realistic art style tend to the action sequences are a little bit more jarring. They're a lot harder to follow. Whereas comics with more cartoony art styles, you can actually, at least in my opinion, you can actually do a lot more with the action set pieces.
Right. So speaking of action set pieces, the most powerful characters in your story by the end of your story, like by the time they've maxed out, they are their peak. Would they be able to take down, I don't know, the Incredible Hulk, or would they be able to take down, like, let's say Naruto characters as at let's not count Naruto Shippuden now, as at the end of the regular series of Naruto. Just I'm using popular shows because I expect like most of our audience should know some of these characters. So about how powerful are your characters?
Okay, what I'll do is I'll probably make a reference from both anime and comics so that all listeners will, or all viewers, will be able to understand what's going on here. So the first thing I should point out is that there are two ends for Iku. There's the end of the first graphic novel, and then it could potentially evolve into a trilogy, but that's some ways away. So if we're just thinking about the end of the first graphic novel, then the characters are probably about the same strength as your MCU characters, more or less. So I would say the main character himself, the titular character, is probably. I haven't seen Thor Ragnarok, so I don't know how strong the Hulk has gotten, but it's probably. I'll say maybe half as strong as the MCU Hulk.
Okay, okay, fair enough.
And if we're using an anime reference, then probably Ichigo from the very beginning of Bleach, where he first gets the Death God powers. That's probably around his strength level. The antagonist, Sana, is a lot stronger. So she's probably trying to think of a good example. She's probably as strong as Orochimaru from Naruto. Maybe I'll say 80% of Orochimaru.
Right.
And if we're thinking of MCU, Ultron, I suppose, in terms of strength level.
Yeah, okay, okay, I feel you. So, knowing you, I know like you're a huge history geek. So, how much
Okay.
of your knowledge of history has affected the story you're telling in this? And is this story largely affected by, um, let's say, African history or just general history in the world?
So in terms of the historical influences, what I want to do is weave that into the world building. So my creative process tends to be story first and world building later. So I sort of build a narrative. So this is the character, and A, B, and C is going to happen to that character, and then I sort of weave another layer on top of it, which is the world building. So in terms of the historical influences. Many of the characters are inspired by real life, historical or legendary mythological characters from African history and mythology. So for example, the main female character, Princess Remy, who appears in the second issue, she is inspired by Moremi Ajasharo. I've probably butchered that.
Oh,
Ajasharo.
listening to you pronounce Yoruba names is hilarious because you've spent so much time in the UK, you don't have your Yoruba accent anymore. My Yoruba
Yeah.
accent isn't 100% either, so I'll pronounce it better than you, but a real Yoruba person will probably still roll their eyes when they hear me. I know it's more,
Yeah.
yeah. You know what? I'm not going to try. Not on video. Continue.
And she was apparently a real person. The historical sources are somewhat conflicted as to whether she was a real person or she was a myth. I mean, the idea is she was probably a real person, but maybe her achievements were somewhat embellished. But she was a warrior princess, more or less. That her people were being captured by a group of mercenaries or warlords known as the forest people. And so she essentially is pretty cool. She pretended to let herself be captured so that she could sort of lead a rebellion from the inside. So it's a
Right.
bit of like a story sort of thing. So that's just one example of the real life historical characters and settings I've tried to weave into the story.
Right. So that means not too many of the characters are inspired by real life people you know, like
Oh no no
your
no!
own
So
friends and family.
oh no no! So that is also part of my character development because at the end of the day, I mean, I know what Moremi did, but I don't know what she was like as a person, right? I mean, clearly she was brave, but you know that doesn't tell you a lot about what a person is like. So in terms of the historical characters, I do pay tribute to them by modeling characters after them. But in terms of what their personalities are like, I think to myself, okay, well, which women in my life do I know that are very brave, and what would they be like? And then I use that to model their personalities.
Let's see, we've had discussions about cliches before, and a friend of mine once said that there's a reason cliches exist. Like sometimes they can be a good thing, but we've had certain conversations about how like anime cliches or comic book cliches can get very ridiculous. Which ones are you
Yeah.
trying to avoid, and which ones are you like deliberately going to use? Like just for example, the main hero and the main villain, they usually have a relationship in which they are either family members or like there's usually a very strong personal connection between them besides just what their goal is. And so which cliches are you avoiding, or which ones are you using basically?
Okay, so in the context of the first graphic novel, I'm certainly avoiding that relationship between the main hero and the main villain. That being said, there is a one thing I learned in university is that the main villain and the main hero are kind of like yin and yang. They're almost like mirror images of each other, but just transposed through different energies. So the villain will be transposed through darker energies, and the hero will be transposed through lighter energies. And so that's kind of how I've modeled the juxtaposition between the two characters, but there's no relationship whatsoever. And I suppose one thing that I've tried to avoid is watching a lot of anime. They get very technical about battle techniques, which I find very fascinating. It's kind of like like fusing what makes chess exciting with what makes boxing or MMA exciting,
Right.
and bringing those two things together. But sometimes the explanations get a little over the top, where a character will perform a certain technique, and whilst he's performing the technique, he's explaining the technique to whom he's performing the technique on, and that person is like just standing there doing nothing. So I had that in earlier drafts of the story, but I've weeded it out because I realize how silly it can be if you sort of take it too far.
I guess our readers have Juni Bar to thank for that.
I actually did that before Junie mentioned that to me, but
Oh,
yeah,
right.
fair enough. He made me extra sensitive to it. But that being said, there are certain sort of character archetypes that my characters are based on. So like the main character, the titular character, he's sort of he's a loner. He's always angry and he's brooding. So he has that kind of like bad boy image that we see in a lot of anti-hero type characters. You
Yeah,
know, we've
and
seen it
his name
with
Iku, it means
yeah,
in Yoruba it means something like murderer or killer, right?
yeah, exactly. So I mean, if you think of certain characters that we've seen in both comics and manga, so say Guts from Berserk or even Sasuke from Naruto, it's probably a bit more popular. And then if we're thinking of comics like The Punisher, um, or I mean, even Batman to a lesser extent,
Yeah.
they all have that kind of like dark, brooding, cold and distant personality type.
Yeah.
But then you also then get to see that they're somewhat like softies on the inside to a certain extent. And so my character is very, very similar, and I've taken that archetype, but I've tried to sort of twist it and give it some new flavors.
All right. So, what emotions do you want someone to have? Like by the time they are done reading the complete story, so they finish the first arc of Iku, what kind of lessons or just emotions do you want them to feel?
In terms of the emotions I want people to get out of the story, one of the contributors to the magazine, Bill Masuku, I often share some of my work with him to get some feedback. And I sent him one of the pages in the comic, and the first thing that he said was, "Oh my god!" He was quite horrified and shocked at the imagery, and that's what I want people to get from it, at least initially. It's just these sort of base, visceral reactions. And it's not because I want to just, throw around blood and guts for the sake of it. It's because this is what the main character, the titular character, has to deal with on a daily basis. I mean, he's essentially suffering from a perpetual post traumatic stress disorder. And so I want the readers to get these visceral emotions so that they can empathize with the main character and understand why having to live every day of his life dealing with such horrors is driving him to madness, even though he has all of these cool powers and abilities. So it starts off with shock and horror, but then it eventually transitions into something akin to empathy and redemption.
Oh, okay, really cool. Um, yeah, as a game developer, I've always heard of this thing of try and make your story tie into your game mechanics so that the game mechanics and the story are not like two separate things. Whatever you're doing in the game makes sense based on what the story is. And from what you just said, your art style and the fact that this thing is gory all tie into what the character is going through and what you want the readers to feel. So that's really cool. So do you let's say this gets really big and you were to make it into a movie in the future, which do you see happening? An animated movie or a live action movie? Which would you prefer?
Um, I know we had Deadpool last year, but I'm not sure if like a live action depiction of some of the illustrations in the comic will work for a mass audience. All of that being said, we've had films like Freddy versus Jason and whatnot. But all in all, I still think an animated adaptation will work better. Animation kind of allows you to give this sort of exaggerated feel to reality that you can't really capture in live action. And also, animation is essentially sequential art as well. So it's an extrapolation of of comics. So I think it would also stay truer to the story. At the end of the day, I got a lot of my inspiration from Ninja Scroll, which was an animated film. I mean Berserk as well, but that's mainly from the manga. So, and then I recently watched Devilman Crybaby on Netflix, and just seeing the way they depicted the visuals, um, really that sort of confirms in my mind that animation is the right path for the story. Were we ever to go down that road?
Right. So in that same line, what kind of music would you imagine playing in this movie?
So I write all of my scripts to one soundtrack or the other, and I always tend to try and get the soundtrack to mimic the mood of whatever scene that I'm trying to write. And the soundtrack I used most often was the various Akatsuki soundtracks from Naruto.
Okay.
Um, If anyone's not familiar with Naruto, Akatsuki is essentially the the team that comprises of the main villains of the story. And I was writing many of the scenes of Iku to that particular soundtrack. If anyone hasn't guessed right now, there's a huge Eastern influence in me. But I want to take something that mimics the mood of those songs or pieces, but just gives it a bit of, but 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 also has a strong African influence as well. So I'm thinking of a lot of percussions. You know, I can imagine a lot of scenes might not even have that much music. It would just be just drums, just basic drums to give that like visceral sort of like you feel like you're there
Yeah.
feel to the story if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, so last question. Is there anything in the powers or abilities in this story that you drew from African, from anything West African, as opposed to just, okay, this guy can shoot fireballs?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of powers and abilities, the short answer is yes. The uh, the hero is, I mean, essentially a shapeshifter, and shapeshifting is very common within various African legends. African legends in West Africa and in Bantu legends as well. You see a lot of examples of shapeshifters. A lot of the creatures as well are inspired by various traditional African creatures. The whole mythology of the world is comes from. It's mainly based off of Dahomey mythology from modern day Benin, fused with. I mean, Dahomey mythology is somewhat similar to Yoruba mythology, and the magic system. The way I've tried to design the magic system as well is again comes from my research into traditional African beliefs and how they conceive or how they think about magic.
Okay, so this was fun. I can't wait for when we swap places and you're interviewing me about my game, but that's a bit further down the line. So, ladies and gentlemen, co founder of Kugali and creator of Iku, Mr. Ziki Nelson.
My pleasure.